All right, so we are going to hit 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4 tonight. So go ahead and open that up, 1 Kings chapter 3. And so when we left the David and Solomon saga, so here's what's happened over the past few weeks. They have survived a coup against them, right? A conspiracy for the throne. So they have survived that. The torch has been passed. David has now died, and Solomon's reign is firmly established. And they used that language last week, firmly established. So how does Solomon firmly establish his reign? He kills everybody, right? He takes out all the threats. We talked about the Godfather and all that sort of stuff. So this is really what he does. This is how it is firmly established in his hands. So let's move on a little bit, and we're going to get into some things about Solomon's rule here tonight. So let's just jump right in. 1 Kings chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. All right, stop already. So we talked about this last week, right? We talked about how the king's harem, so his wives and his concubines, is less about a king's own indulgence, and it really has more to do with the alliances and the relationships that he has struck up in his reign. And so that's what the women represent of different places. And so right here, it just kind of spells that out for you in verse 1 of chapter 3. So if we read it again, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because of that alliance, he married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So I was reading this, and I thought, here's a question that came up for me. I don't know if you guys have the same question. But what's the difference between the city of David and what we often call Jerusalem? The city of David on one hand, and the Jerusalem. I kind of always thought these were the same thing, like synonymous. But the city of David and Jerusalem. So, in case you didn't know, Jerusalem was not always the capital of God's people. Jerusalem at one point was a foreign city that they come in and they conquer. So it was a city belonging to a foreign people called the Jebusites, and then King David conquers it, and he makes this city that already existed, probably more likely a town that already existed, and he makes it his new capital. So, for instance, we read this in 2 Samuel chapter 5. It says, "The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there." Again, these are foreigners. And then a few verses later, "Then David took up residence in the fortress," and he calls it, what does he call it, of course? The city of David. So later on, Alexander conquers stuff, and he names it Alexandria, right? So this is really what we have with David. Names it after himself. But anyway, it's kind of news to me that this is really a foreigner's city at the time, and then the Israelites really take over it. So David conquers. You get the beginning of what we know as Jerusalem, which then continues to grow. Then Solomon takes over, and Solomon has a number of building projects, which we'll cover several of those. The temple and the new palace, and then Solomon expands the city. So here's a few pictures for reference. You probably can't read a whole lot of the writing on it. Maybe you can. But this is under David, and so you see Jerusalem is kind of built kind of with a hillside overlooking it. So the hillside up here is called Mount Moriah, if you can't quite see that. And then David's Jerusalem is kind of really all centered around the bottom of that mountain behind the fortress walls, things like that. So the development is going to spread, though, up the hill. And so same picture, but this is Solomon's Jerusalem. So you see he basically kind of doubles it in size, and he moves it up the hill to Mount Moriah. And up on the top of the hill is the projects that we'll get to, like the temple, like Solomon's palace, things like that. And so what Solomon does is he basically doubles the size, moves it up the hill. So when this text talks about the city of David, it's kind of like you would go and visit. There's a number of foreign cities that do this. We like to go to Prague, for instance. That's like our favorite city in the whole world. We've been there several times. And in Prague, if you go, you'll find these different districts. And one in particular is called Old Town, but there's also a New Town in Prague. And here's what's funny. New Town, is like 500 years old. So it's older than anything in this country, right? New Town is older than anything in this country. But you should see how old Old Town is, right? Because it's even older. So when they talk about the city of David, what they're really talking about is probably what you would call Old Town in Jerusalem. So if we go back to the other picture, this is David's Jerusalem. And so that district that you see there at the bottom of the hill becomes really the city of David, whereas Jerusalem is the bigger developing city. So the city of David is kind of like Old Town, you might say. And so when they refer to the city of David, they're talking about the oldest developments of Jerusalem. So just kind of interesting. How do you distinguish the city of David with Jerusalem as a whole? It's a district. So verse 2. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. So this idea of high places is something that you'll see over and over again as you read through about the kings as well. And so it makes you kind of wonder, okay, what are the high places? You don't get a whole lot of details, but as you read through the records of the kings, you do get the idea that they're not good. So for instance, you'll read later on in Kings about a king named Asa. And so we talked about David being the standard of the kings that follow. And so when it talks about Asa, it compares him to David. And it said Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father, or really his ancestor, not his actual father, as his ancestor David had done. And then again, a few verses later, although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. So you have these kings who really are in history, they're good kings. And so you'll have something like Asa where it's like, yeah, King so-and-so did well, but he didn't do this one thing right. And it's usually they didn't remove the high places. So you get an idea, even though it doesn't spell it out, they should have done this, but they didn't. And it's kind of like a small stain on their record. So all this goes back to Deuteronomy. If you want to know what the high places are, it goes back to Deuteronomy. So we're going to shift gears. This is King Asa. He's after Solomon. Let's go now way before Solomon, and we're going to talk about what happens when the Israelites first enter the Promised Land and what they're supposed to do. So go back in time before Solomon. Deuteronomy 12, it says this. These are the decrees and the laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. So again, this is back in time. Israelites are just leaving Egypt now, and they're going to the Promised Land, and they're about to take possession of the land. So verse 2, destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree, where, this is the important part, where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. So here's what we can kind of piece together from this verse. The practice of worshiping God in these high places is really a carryover from what the nations they are dispossessing had done. So they go into a land that's not theirs. There's foreigners already in the land. They have to take over the land, right? And either, subdue the foreigners or whatever it is. And so the practice that's already happening is these foreigners who worship pagan gods, they worship at these high mountains and at these high places. And so what ends up happening is Israel comes in and they start practicing, they start worshiping their God, worshiping Yahweh, in the same way that everybody else had worshiped their pagan gods. Does this make sense so far? So, Israel is supposed to be different, right? We've learned this for the past couple weeks. They're supposed to be holy, which means set apart, right? But they go into this land and they worship God like everybody else has already been worshiping their pagan gods. Verse 3, it says, break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. It says, again, this is important, you must not worship the Lord your God in their way, the way that they did it. Israel has to be holy and set apart. But you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. And if you were in Deuteronomy now, you could look at your own Bible, and the word name is probably going to be capitalized, which is exactly how it talks about Solomon building the temple. Solomon is going to build a temple for the name, with a capital N, of the Lord. So this, back here in Deuteronomy, again, long before Solomon, this connects to what we're going to end up talking about with Solomon. So they're going to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling, a.k.a. Solomon's future temple, right? All right, we'll cover that a bit more here in a minute. But so now let's go back to Kings. We see in verse 2, Israel is given an excuse if they need to keep worshiping at high places. So it says, the people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places. Why? Because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. So this dwelling that it talks about in Deuteronomy doesn't exist yet. So they're kind of allowed, it's tolerated to keep doing what they're doing because we don't have this place yet. But that excuse is about to run out here in Solomon's lifetime because this temple is going to be built. And so the idea is that when the temple is built, we're going to centralize worship into one place. So you can no longer go to every little hilltop and mountaintop and burn sacrifices and things like that. Now that we have this dwelling, this house for God, all the worship needs to happen in this one place in Jerusalem. So if you continue doing high places after the temple is built, well, that's what the kings after Solomon are guilty for, like, for instance, Asa that we talked about, right? Everyone's supposed to be at the temple because the temple is built, but Asa neglects to get rid of the high places even still. Does that make sense, what high places are? Okay, verse 3. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except, here it is, that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. And again, you'll see that throughout Kings. It's a stain on them if they forget to do that. Verse 4. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. So Solomon goes to Gibeon. It says it's the most important high place at the time. Why is it the most important high place? Gibeon is a few miles outside of Jerusalem, and it was thought at that time, really it says at that time, that the tabernacle, which Moses received instructions for. So it's another one of those sections in the early books where it's just lots of details about building this and how many feet this is going to be. So Moses has the tabernacle built. The tabernacle is kind of a traveling version of the temple. So it consists of, different hardware and things like that, and then a whole lot of like curtains and cloth that goes over it. It's kind of a traveling tent. And so I wonder how much of the original thing is left, because this is long after Moses, right? But whatever is left or whatever has been rebuilt for that tabernacle, it now in Solomon's time sits at Gibeon, which is why Gibeon is the most important high place that Solomon can go to. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." How do you get in on that dream right there? I want to have a dream where God says, "Ask me for whatever you want." That'd be awesome. So dreams like this are not that uncommon to see in ancient literature, so especially as they relate to kings and leaders. So we talked about Israel's last judge a few weeks ago. Their last judge is a man named Samuel. Samuel has a dream a lot like this, where he's kind of in front of God and he talks to God, like they have a conversation together. And so a dream story, especially where God and the person are literally kind of in conversation, obviously it's going to do a whole lot to legitimate their claims to the throne, right? So if anybody has any questions about Solomon belonging at the throne, well, he has a vision or a dream where he talks to God directly. So obviously God is supportive of this, right? The rest of the dream is pretty straightforward. Verse 6, Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties." So, is Solomon a little child at this point in the game? No, right? No. Solomon already has married an Egyptian princess, and even in ancient standards, I would imagine they still don't marry off like little children. That's not really how it goes. So the phrase where we're getting little child is this Hebrew phrase, na'ar katon. So it can mean little child. It also can mean young adult. It also can mean somebody who was just kind of generally inexperienced at what they're doing. So they're a child in whatever their position or their task is. And so knowing that this phrase doesn't always mean little child, it helps us with another kind of problematic story later on in Kings. So who knows of the story of the prophet Elisha and the bears later on in Kings? Oh, it's Allison, D, Josh, Elisha and the bears. Okay, so what happens with Elisha and the bears? Elisha is Elijah's successor. And so what happens is there's a story where at first glance it looks like he's being teased by some young boys, right? They make fun of his bald head in this story. He's being teased by young boys. And then for whatever reason, Elisha takes overwhelming revenge on these young boys and he sicks two bears on them. And they maul children in this story. So if you look at this just at a glance, this is one of those problematic Old Testament stories, right? It's hard to know what to do. Why does this happen, right? And so it helps a little. They're using this phrase, na'arkaton, when it talks about those boys. So really it probably was a group of young men and probably a group of ignorant young men. Now, it doesn't totally clean up the story. There's still some explaining to do for Elisha at that point, but it helps a little to know that these are not children in this story. These are probably kind of ignorant young adults. There's still more going on, but we've got maybe half of it cleaned up a little bit. So back in 1 Kings, though, scholars think that Solomon was probably about 20 years old, so he's not a little child. He's probably more like this inexperienced sort of person. So which, of course, then makes God's favor and God's intervention in whatever God might be offering Solomon in this dream, it makes it very, very important for this apparently inexperienced new king of Israel. So verse 8, your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? So when Solomon says to govern, what really is being translated is kind of more like the word judge. So Solomon over and over says, who is able to judge this great people of Israel, right? And so here we kind of see some of the old practices and the old expectations of leadership from the judges, right? That's the whole period before the kings. You have a period of judges. And so you see some of that still carrying over into how they think of their kings. So nowadays, and really in even somewhat recent history, we would think of kings and rulers on a much kind of higher level. They're at a 30,000-foot view with their people. They'd make political decisions and military decisions and things like that. And so we don't look at rulers this way, that they would get in the middle and they would judge disputes, things like that. And so this is really taking us back to a role that even Moses had long before this. We see these stories about Moses, and he's in the middle of judging disputes between kind of the commoners, you would say, right? And so he gets involved, there's a disagreement, and Moses, the leader of all Israel, is helping like two people settle this thing about who stole someone's sheep, right? Like it's not what we think of when we think of rulers. But you see Solomon, even later on when he's a king, you see some of that still in the idea of what a king does. And so they're still trying to kind of shed that concept of judges. And so here, just a minute, you're going to see Solomon, the king over all Israel. He sits down to a squabble with two prostitutes, right? Not what we think that a king should be doing. So, verse 10, the Lord was pleased that Solomon asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience and keep to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. And then Solomon awoke and he realized it had been a dream. So, amazing offer on the table, right, from God. And so a vision and conversation between God and Solomon only serves to confirm him in his position as king, and he really hit the anointing that's on him. And so in this vision also, Solomon looks really good. So he might be inexperienced, but he has enough wisdom to ask for wisdom, right? He has enough wisdom. He's not a young hotshot who immediately says, you know what, I want to be rich, I want to be famous. Solomon looks good in the vision because he doesn't ask for selfish things. He has enough wisdom to say, I want wisdom, right? So all this is making Solomon look better and better. But also, don't miss this about God's offer. God's offer actually is conditional for Solomon, right? It actually is a conditional offer. So this is what the Old Testament would really call a covenant. And you come into contact with covenants several times in the Old Testament. So there's covenants between God and Noah, and God and Abraham, and God and Moses, and God and David, and now God and Solomon. And so part of God's offer to Solomon, the covenant really says, if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, then I will give you a long life, right? A conditional sort of agreement. And so we're going to want to remember that, especially when things begin to fall apart for Solomon later on. This whole thing was based on the idea that he would be faithful. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and then he gave a feast for all his court. So what's interesting is that Solomon goes to Gibeon to sacrifice because, again, that's where the tabernacle was said to have been, this tabernacle that really came from Moses. And then he goes back to Jerusalem and sacrifices in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So at this point in history, interesting thing, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle are in two separate places, right? And so it kind of makes it interesting why Solomon went to Gibeon in the first place. Because for them, the Ark of the Covenant really signified God's presence. So a few times in Scripture, it calls the Ark God's footstool. So it's the very place that God would dwell on earth. The Ark doesn't contain God because nothing can really contain God. But if God was going to show up somewhere on earth, it was probably going to be at the Ark of the Covenant. And so you wonder, okay, why does Solomon go to the tabernacle at Gibeon if God's presence is going to be at the Ark of the Covenant? We really don't know. It's kind of an interesting part of the story. But either way, he makes that his second stop. So he goes to the Ark of the Covenant, kind of cover all his bases. Hey, I'll stop there on the way home, and I'll just cover everything. So anyway, gets to both places. Verse 16. Now, two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. And I'm wondering right here, how did two prostitutes get an audience with the king of all Israel, right? This kind of seems strange. One of them said, "Pardon me, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone, and there was no one in the house to help, no one in the house but the two of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, 'No, the living one is my son. The dead one is yours.' But the first one insisted, 'No, the dead one is yours. The living one is mine.' And so they argued before the king." So this case is actually difficult for a couple of reasons. And these reasons aren't necessarily fair, but it's kind of the situation of two prostitutes at that time. So, two prostitutes coming before the king, you would assume already their word is suspect, just by the nature of who they are. And so you wouldn't trust what either one of them are saying. You would assume deceit out of both of them. And because they're prostitutes, it's very, very unlikely that dad is going to come through the door and say, "Oh yeah, that's my son," right? That's not going to happen. So you don't have a second party who's going to say, "Oh yeah, I can vouch for this, that, or the other." Also, it says specifically in verse 18, "We were alone, and there was no one in the house but the two of us." So there's no eyewitnesses that can confirm or deny any of this. And so all Solomon can do is rely on the words of two untrustworthy sources, like equally untrustworthy, right? It's just, she said this, How do you know? And so if you're reading it, so you might already know the story, you know how it turns out already, that sort of thing. But if you're reading this for the first time, you might be tempted to think, well, this is an impossible case, right? How do you know who's telling the truth? Neither one of them really have a whole lot to bank on. So let's get to it. So verse 23, the king said, "This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king, and he gave an order: "Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." Yikes. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Yuck. The king gave this ruling: "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So, at the end of chapter 3, Solomon kind of solves this unsolvable problem, right? So again, you have two sources. You don't know who to trust, right? But Solomon knows exactly how to respond so that the truth will come out because he is so wise, right? He knows how to get to the bottom of this case. So here's what's fascinating. Some commentators actually kind of see a sad irony in this story. And it's impossible to tell if the irony is intentional from the author or if it's just something that we notice because we know the whole story. But the irony here is, wise Solomon will refuse to literally divide this child. But later, unwise Solomon, through the things that he does, the kingdom itself is actually going to be divided. Does that kind of make sense? So he won't divide a child, but through the unwise parts of his life, his very kingdom is going to be divided. So again, we're not sure if that's an intentional sort of irony there or if it just kind of just happens to be there, but it is something interesting to think about as you think about this part of the story and also where we know the story ends up going. There is something that is divided later on in the story. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 3. Let's go on to chapter 4. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel, and these were his chief officials, and I'm not going to try to pronounce all these names, but let me just hit a few. So you're going to go through verse, let's see, is it 6? Yeah, so this is all through verse 6. And so as you kind of just browse through there, you're going to notice a few names that we have seen before. So you have Zadok the priest. Zadok is the priest who is faithful to Solomon. You see him in verse 4. You see Zadok's son in verse 1. You see Benaiah, who was Benaiah? Remember Benaiah from last week? He's the assassin. He's the hitman, right? So Benaiah is still there. He's in verse 4. You see the sons of Nathan in verse 5. Nathan is most likely the Nathan who conspired with Solomon's mom Bathsheba at the beginning of this whole story, right? So that's probably the same Nathan there. What's interesting is that in this list, you also see Abiathar. Do we remember who Abiathar was? So look, you see him, verse 4, Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Why is it surprising? Huh? It was David's priest, but why is it surprising that he's in this list right here? So last week, Solomon takes out all of the threats and all the rivals and all the people who did him wrong. The one person that did was a part of the conspiracy, but Solomon can't bring himself to kill is the priest, right? And it's Abiathar. So Abiathar ends up going into exile. He's banished. He lives the rest of his life outside the city. And so, then he's in this list, right? And so scholars kind of disagree on what this actually means. So it's possible that Abiathar somehow finds himself back in the good graces of the king, and he's in this list. Or it's possible that this is just more of a comprehensive list of who all has ever been in Solomon's court and administration, that sort of thing. So this list might reflect a time before Abiathar was actually removed. So a side note, not everything in Scripture is going to be chronological. And so here's what's hard is you have a book like Kings, and it looks like you're reading history. And I don't know about you, when I read history, especially more recent history, I assume that you're telling me everything in order, right? That's not how the Bible works. And so sometimes it'll tell things more thematically than in chronological order. And so here, it might just kind of stop in the middle of Solomon and say, oh yeah, by the way, these are all the people who have ever worked for Solomon. Whether it makes sense in this location after this story or not, this is just kind of everybody who's worked for him. And you'll see that again and again, not just in Kings, but throughout Scripture. Things that you want to be chronological aren't always chronological. When you read the stories about Jesus, you see the same different episodes. They're told in a different order in different Gospels. So they can't be chronological because one gospel is different than the other, right? And so sometimes it'll tell them thematically versus chronological. All right, then it goes on to talk about Solomon's governors. It says this: Solomon had 12 district governors all over Israel who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year. So the districts end up providing for Solomon's household, which does include his family, but it also really, his household really means all those who are kind of in his charge. So it can mean his officials, it can mean kind of the bureaucracy of the kingdom itself. And so it's a pretty big charge to provide for Solomon's household. It's his family, but definitely not just his family.
It's kind of like providing a meal each week for Bible study.
Right. Yeah. It's not just my family, it's all of you. And so the 12 districts, if you think of it this way, might be a weird way to think about it, but they kind of all have like a federal tax back to the capital, right? All the districts of all Israel have a responsibility back to Jerusalem. We all, in these 50 states, have some responsibilities back to kind of the federal government, don't we? We see that about this time of year. All right, so and it says, verse 8, these are their names, and these are all the governors' names. I won't walk through all those either, but you go from verse 8 through verse 19, listing all the names in their territories. So a couple of interesting things to notice about this section, 8 through 19. So Solomon has 12 governors. If you're familiar with Israel at all, and you hear that Solomon, the kingdom, has 12 governors, well, you're going to assume they're based on what? The 12 tribes. This is not how Solomon does business. So here's how it breaks down. There are only 5 actual tribes that are mentioned in that list. So again, if you kind of browse through 8 through 19, there's only 5 actual tribes. They're Ephraim, Naphtali, Asher, Issachar, and Benjamin. And only 3 times is the tribe itself the territory, the boundary. And then in one other case, it's the tribe, the territory is the tribe plus something. Or in the last case, it's the tribe, but only a portion of the tribe. So the tribes are not the clean boundaries of what the districts actually are. They're based on something different. So kind of keep that in your head. Also, a number of the administrative centers that you see in these districts, they're actually in cities that were never a part of the tribal boundaries. So they're like more recent acquisitions that Solomon has gained in his conquest. So basically what's happening is Solomon does not prioritize the historic tribes at all in their boundaries. He's basing things on something else, and his districts are based on something different. So one more thing to notice, and this really kind of requires some digging. And actually, all this with these names, it's taking some digging. So if you don't notice this stuff, it's not you. Like, you really kind of have to dig in and pull this stuff out. But a number of the officials that are listed, they would have had strong ties with one particular tribe. So Solomon doesn't really acknowledge or honor the traditional historic tribes and their boundaries, but he does honor one, his own. So a lot of these officials are come out of the tribe of Judah, which is Solomon and David's tribe. A couple of the officials are even mentioned, and you can see this in the list. They're Solomon's son-in-laws in this tribe, or in the districts. So all that to say, it's possible that Solomon, in this wisdom that he has, it's possible that he wants to reorganize the kingdom into 12 more or less equal parts. And the divisions of the tribes are not really equal. And so he wants to kind of change things up and make things more equal for political or economical reasons or whatever it is. But it's also possible that Solomon wants to set up 12 altogether different districts. And therefore what that does is it begins to weaken the tribal system altogether. So the tribal system comes with different loyalties. If you're from the tribe of, Benjamin, for instance, then you have loyalties there and people have loyalties to you. So the story about Shimei from last week, we mentioned that all Shimei has to do is go just outside of Jerusalem to his tribe of Benjamin, and there he may have a whole bunch of supporters because of these tribal loyalties. So if Solomon redistricts, he weakens the tribal loyalties because the districts aren't based on tribes at all. Also, it seems like there's a whole lot of, what was that?
Was that like gerrymandering?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So you're kind of rigging the system a little bit. Also, it seems like there's a lot of like favoritism and even nepotism in the officials that Solomon is choosing. So he's favoring his friends and his family in these positions of governor. So again, this might seem like wisdom on one hand, but also this sort of disruption of the tribal system is not going to be popular. And so this disruption may end up leading to, again, the overall division of the kingdom that comes towards the end of Solomon's reign. So it might seem like wisdom to him, but there's kind of long-term fallout effects of what this actually means. Did I lose my connection? Oh, no. Try casting again. Let's see if we can get that back up. Uh-oh, maybe not. We'll have to go without it. It's all good. Oh, there was a map. I forgot. That's not it. That's not Israel at all. Okay, let's move on and we'll see if that catches up. Okay, so I turned a page and I didn't mean to. I'm going to end up having to take this out of the recording. It makes me look foolish. Okay, there we go. Verse 20. The people of Judah and Israel. What's that? Now you're just looking at the screensaver from Google.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Well, this is kind of a bummer. All right, whatever. That's the fishing boat of the disciples. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, verse 20. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And Solomon ruled over the kingdoms from the Euphrates River, there it is, to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores. You may have a footnote that says that's 5.5 tons of the finest flour, and 60 cores, so double, 11 tons of meal. So remember, these are daily provisions for Solomon. 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. So these two little sections, so you have the description of the land boundaries, and then you also have the massive amount of food that's required for the kingdom. Is really there to show people, okay, this is how big of a deal Solomon was. So this is how big his household was. This is how big the kingdom was. And it's unclear if maybe these are literal things, or as the kids might say today, this is a bit of a flex that we're seeing in Kings, right? So in case you were wondering, Solomon's a really, really big deal, and you have it here. Verse 24. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River from Tipsha to Gaza, and he had peace on all sides. So what we saw earlier, that's verse 24. What we saw earlier in verse 20 kind of goes along with it. It says, the people of Israel, they ate and they drank and they were happy. And then in verse 24, they had peace on all sides. So you get the impression that things are settled in Israel, right? They have the chance to be happy. They have a chance to kind of have some recreation or whatever. And so here's what's interesting. In the book of Chronicles, so what happens is the books of Samuel and Kings kind of tell you the story really from King Saul all the way through to the kings of towards the exile. Chronicles comes back and does the exact same thing. So think of it like the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they tell the same stories about Jesus. Well, Chronicles tells the same stories that Samuel and Kings does, and so you have some differences there. When you read Chronicles, there's a part in Chronicles where David asks God if he can be the one to build him his temple. God tells him no, because David has been a man of war. He's been a warrior, and so God doesn't want his temple to be built by a warrior. He says, no, you're not going to do it, but your son's going to do it because he will be a man of peace, right? And so we see it here back in Kings, verse 24, they have peace on all sides. And so this, according to God, at least in Chronicles, this is part of the thing that makes Solomon able to build the temple. Verse 25. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Let me see if I can get this again, because this is... I want to show my map. I can cast down to the social hall, but I can't cast here, just so you all know. That's not going to work. No, it won't go over there. Okay, either way, I'll try to describe it to you. All right, so two things about that passage. Let me read it again. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. So two things about that passage. The first reference of Dan to Beersheba is really a way for them to express just the breadth of the kingdom altogether. So if there was a handy map up here, like I have prepared, you would see the kingdom of Israel, and you would see Dan, the city of Dan, all the way to the north, and you would see Beersheba all the way to the south. And so that's how they would talk about their kingdom. Dan to Beersheba is basically everything. So everything from Virginia to California. That's how we might talk about this. So Dan to Beersheba is their shorthand for basically everything in Israel. So quick question, this matters to us. How did Danville get its name? The river, correct. How did the river get its name? What was that? From the Bible, yeah. So nobody got this at the first session. Danville got its name from this reference from Dan to Beersheba. So here's the story. So in 1728, there was a colonist named William Byrd. What's that? Oh. Who knows this? Oh, yeah. So 1728, there's a colonist named William Byrd, and he's sent on this expedition to determine what's the true boundary between Virginia and North Carolina. So he's traveling this sort of area. What else kind of meanders between Virginia and North Carolina? The Dan River does, right? So he has this mission to determine, okay, what's the real boundary? So on his travels, he ends up camping upstream from what is now Danville. And so when he's there, he loves the area, he thinks it's beautiful, and he kind of prophesies that, okay, one day there's going to be a big settlement, there's going to be a city here, it's going to be awesome. And so while he's there, he names the river where he camped the Dan River, because in his travels, he felt like he had traveled so far that it was like traveling from Dan to Beersheba. So he pulls out this Old Testament Bible reference to name this river close to us, from Dan to Beersheba. So he names it the Dan River. So, trivia for you. But Tisa already knew that, so you're good. All right, there's two references here, though. So verse 25 has another early American reference in it. Does anybody catch the other early American reference in verse 25? It's all good. Nobody got it this morning either. So, there's a reference to someone sitting under their own vine and their own fig tree in verse 25, right? And so you see that in several times in Scripture as well. And that becomes kind of the scriptural shorthand for talking about a land in peace and prosperity. So you sit under your own vine and fig tree, meaning you've got the time and the availability to enjoy the simple pleasures in life. So the kingdom's at peace. You can just kind of relax at your home. So that's the Old Testament shorthand for at peace, everything is settled, right? Keep that in your head for just a minute. Table that. And let's go a few hundred years later to Rome. There is a guy named Cincinnatus. It's my hometown's namesake. Rome finds itself in a war emergency. And Rome's custom, if they really, really have to, they're a republic, but they can give power over to one person in the state of emergency. And so what they do is they give sole power over to Cincinnatus. And so he serves faithfully. He gets them through this war struggle they're in. And then he just decides to hand the power back to the people, right? So you would think back then somebody gets all the power, well, they're just going to find a way to keep it for themselves. he gives the power right back to Rome, and he retires to the country. So very inspiring. Rome was a republic, and so very inspiring figure for them. So these two things, vine and fig tree, Cincinnatus, his heritage. Both of these things are huge inspirations to George Washington. So George Washington, general in the Revolution, serves 2 terms as president long before 2 terms was part of the rules, right? And then he just decides to step down. So he, kind of like Cincinnatus, does the job he's been given, and then he just kind of gives the power back. And so it looks like Cincinnatus was a big inspiration to George Washington. Also, he loved the reference to vine and fig tree in the Bible, and that becomes his shorthand for retirement. So he gets this from the Bible. Vine and fig tree means you've settled, everything's at peace. And so George Washington uses it in several pieces of correspondence to talk about retiring and living under his own vine and fig tree. So we went to New York a few weeks ago. We saw the musical Hamilton. Have you seen Hamilton before on TV and Disney Plus or in person? Just one person? So in Hamilton, this is a reference. The character Washington in Hamilton sings about living under his own vine and fig tree. So all that to say, so usually we're looking at the Bible and we're trying to uncover the history and the context about what's there and what's kind of giving us these stories, or what are the Hebrew idioms, all that sort of stuff. But sometimes we can look at the Bible and see how it shapes later history, right? So again, no idea what's happening here. But you have this whole idea, vine and fig tree, you have Dan to Beersheba, you have all this stuff, influences later history. Should I just turn that off? So it's just kind of fun to see what influences come out of the Bible. All right, verse 26. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Another flex for you. 27. The district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They also brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses. And so then after that, starting at verse 29, we kind of have this summary statement of all of Solomon's wisdom. And it says this: God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. So keep in mind that breadth of understanding phrase. We're going to come back to that, breadth of understanding. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East and greater than the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about the animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So this last kind of paragraph tells us, how eclectic Solomon's interest and how eclectic his wisdom actually was. He has amazing talents. He writes poetry, writes songs, and he's wiser than several classically wise figures. So those names that are in the middle are kind of classically wise people that they would have compared him to. And guess what? He's wiser than all of them as well. All right, so back in verse 29, we see this idea about Solomon having this breadth of understanding. And it's really what's there is another Hebrew idiom, so it's another kind of unique thing in Hebrew that really means a broadness of heart and mind. So what we get translated as breadth of understanding really means to be broad or wide in heart and mind. Now, similar phrases in Psalms and Proverbs are actually taken negatively. So you see the same phrase again about broadness or wideness of heart and mind, and it's a bad thing. I wonder if I can show you these. Nope, not going to work. So, in Psalm 105, whoever has haughty eyes and a proud heart, so the proud heart is that wideness of heart and mind. Whoever has haughty eyes and a proud heart, I will not tolerate. This is in Psalms. Proverbs 21, haughty eyes and a proud heart, same phrase. The unplowed field of the wicked produce sin. So in all these situations, all these places, so you have breadth of understanding in Kings, but you end up having proud heart in Psalms and proud heart in Proverbs. All of those are basically the same Hebrew words that are literally a wide heart and mind, right? So sometimes it's taken negatively. And so you wonder, it leaves you with the question, is the author meaning it negative in Kings? So is he trying to tell you how amazing Solomon's wisdom is, or is this another foreshadowing of Solomon's downfall? So broad heart or mind, today we might wonder, is this the author's way of saying Solomon actually was too open-minded, right? His wisdom took him so far, and then he kind of opened his mind and accepted too many things, right? Which really makes sense with the rest of Solomon's story. So Solomon gets into trouble, and he ends up having a number of wives and a number of concubines from all over the place, undoubtedly from different religions, worshiping different gods. And so it's possible that what we're looking at is Solomon opens his mind to too many things and too many people, and his broadness of heart and mind is really his downfall in the end. So if you're just simply open to whatever, then you might wonder, okay, well, where do your convictions actually lie, right? If your mind is open to anything, okay, what's actually your conviction, right? Where do you stand on stuff? And so again, this could be a foreshadowing of where Solomon's story ends up going. And we already saw at the very beginning of tonight's lesson, he marries an Egyptian princess who undoubtedly worshiped Egyptian gods, right? And so this is a big Israelite no-no. And Solomon starts his reign by going outside of Israel. And so this kind of leads me right into my so what section of tonight. So what does this mean for us here today? We live in a culture now where open-mindedness and tolerance are really, really, really big values, right? And so I would ask the same question. Where is the place where we open ourselves too much and we lose what our actual convictions are, right? And I think this is not like a one extreme or the other. I think there's a place to be able to say, I'm open to someone else's experiences. I can kind of, resonate with my neighbor and whatever they're feeling, things like that. And so what I'm not saying is don't go be a jerk to people in the community, right? Don't be a jerk to your neighbors. You should have an open mind and be able to talk and converse with them. But at the same time, at what point do we kind of end up opening ourselves wide open, accepting almost everything, and then we lose who we actually are? I'll steal another line from Hamilton that only one person has seen. But there's a line in Hamilton where the character Hamilton asks somebody else, he says, if you stand for nothing, then what do you fall for? Anything, right? So again, this idea of open-mindedness and tolerance, it all seems well and good until just simply everything is tolerated and there's no place for you to stand on any sort of conviction, right? So that's kind of the thought that I would leave you with. Man, we need to check our internet connection because I had some good stuff for you. Any questions about tonight?